Michael Davidson had lived in his suburban home on Maple Ridge Drive for over 15 years. At 42, the software developer had chosen this particular neighborhood for its peaceful atmosphere and sense of community. The quiet cul-de-sac, with its 10 modestly sized but well-maintained houses, boasted manicured lawns, friendly neighbors who exchanged holiday cards and occasional barbecue invitations, and a general understanding that everyone respected each other's space while still being there in times of need. The crown jewel of Michael's backyard was his 24-foot above-ground pool, installed 12 years ago during a particularly hot summer. It had become something of a neighborhood fixture, with Michael occasionally hosting informal weekend gatherings where neighbors would bring dishes and drinks while their children splashed around under supervision. He wasn't particularly outgoing by nature, but these gatherings had helped him forge connections in a community where he otherwise might have remained the quiet bachelor who worked from home. Everything changed when the O'Connors, a retired couple who had lived next door for as long as Michael had been there, decided to downsize and move to Florida. Their modest 3-bedroom colonial sold quickly, and Michael had been optimistic about his new neighbors until he actually met them. The Pattersons moved in 3 years ago. Richard, an overworked accountant who was rarely home, Linda, a stay-at-home mother with apparently endless free time, and their 2 children, 10-year-old Ella and 8-year-old Mason. While Richard seemed pleasant enough on the rare occasions Michael encountered him, Linda Patterson was another story entirely. Michael had mentally nicknamed her Karen after their very first interaction, when she rang his doorbell at 7:15 a.m. on a Saturday, mere hours after the moving trucks had departed, to inform him that his recycling bin was 6 inches over the property line and needed to be moved immediately. When Michael, still in his pajamas and barely awake, had apologized and promised to move it later that morning, Linda had crossed her arms, tapped her foot impatiently, and declared, "I'd really prefer if you took care of it now while I'm here to confirm it's been done properly." That first encounter set the tone for their neighbor relationship. Within weeks, Linda had established herself as the self-appointed neighborhood watchdog. She nitpicked everything from the height of lawn grass to the color of front doors, claiming dubious HOA violations that, upon checking, often didn't exist in the actual rulebook. Local businesses knew her by sight. She had a reputation for demanding to speak to managers over the slightest perceived slight or inconvenience. Despite Linda's difficult personality, Michael had maintained cordial relations with the Patterson family. He understood that the children shouldn't suffer because of their mother's behavior, and when Ella and Mason gazed longingly at his pool during that first summer, he'd established clear but generous guidelines. They could use his pool during specific hours when he wasn't home, provided they had explicit permission beforehand, adult supervision at all times, usually their teenage cousin who babysat them, and followed his safety rules without exception. For 3 summers, this arrangement had worked reasonably well. The children were generally well-behaved, and Richard occasionally dropped by with a 6-pack of craft beer as a thank-you gesture. Linda, however, had gradually begun treating Michael's pool as if it were a community amenity rather than private property, making comments like, "We should really discuss getting a new pool filter," or "I've been thinking we should replace those steps with something safer." Michael always politely but firmly reminded her that it was his pool on his property, though he appreciated her concern. As the 3rd summer with the Pattersons as neighbors came to an end, Michael had no idea that high. As another winter thawed into spring, Michael found himself once again facing the annual ritual of pool maintenance. This year, however, the task seemed more daunting than ever. The aging above-ground pool, now approaching its 13th season, was showing unmistakable signs of deterioration despite his diligent care. The liner had developed several small tears that required patching, the pump made an ominous grinding noise even after replacement parts were installed, and one section of the aluminum wall had begun to buckle slightly, a potential safety hazard that concerned him. One particularly frustrating Saturday in April, Michael found himself balanced precariously on a ladder, attempting to fix a stubborn leak while the cold drizzle peppered his back. As he fumbled with waterproof tape that refused to adhere in the damp conditions, he made a decision that had been brewing for months. It was time for an upgrade. That evening, wrapped in a warm robe with a hot cup of coffee, Michael began researching in-ground pool options on his laptop. The initial sticker shock gave way to excitement as he calculated the long-term benefits. Not only would a properly installed in-ground pool require less maintenance, but according to several real estate websites, it could increase his property value by as much as 7%, potentially paying for itself if he ever decided to sell. After consultations with 3 different pool companies, Michael settled on Coleman Pools and Landscaping, a family-owned business with excellent reviews and a portfolio of work that aligned with his vision. A rectangular in-ground pool with a modest patio surround, subtle lighting, and a small waterfall feature for ambience. The timeline would require removing the existing pool by mid-May to begin excavation, with the project completed before the peak of summer heat arrived in July. Before signing the contract, Michael decided to inform his neighbors about the upcoming construction. A courtesy he felt was appropriate given the temporary noise and increased traffic the project would bring to their quiet street. On a mild Sunday afternoon, he walked door to door, explaining his plans and the approximate timeline. Most neighbors responded with congratulations and genuine interest, a few even requesting to see the design sketches. The Andersons, whose teenage daughters occasionally used Michael's pool, expressed mild disappointment but quickly transitioned to asking questions about the new design. The elderly Johnsons were concerned primarily about construction vehicles blocking the street. The Thompsons, who had young twins, asked if the contractor would ensure the construction area remained securely fenced at all times. Each conversation was pleasant and considerate, with neighbors expressing appreciation for the advance notice. Michael saved the Pattersons for last, knowing this might be the most challenging conversation. He caught them just as they were returning from what appeared to be a shopping trip, Richard struggling with multiple bags while Linda supervised. Michael explained his decision, emphasizing that the current pool was becoming a safety concern and mentioning that the removal company would arrive the following Monday. Richard nodded understandingly, even seeming interested as Michael described some features of the new design. "Sounds great, man. How long will construction take?" he asked, juggling bags to shake Michael's hand. Linda, however, remained unnervingly silent throughout the explanation. The smile that had greeted Michael, the practiced, tight-lipped variety she reserved for neighbors, had slowly morphed into a deep frown. Her eyes narrowed slightly as she glanced between her husband and Michael. When Michael finished speaking and looked to her for a response, she simply pressed her lips together more firmly and turned toward their front door. "Linda?" Richard called after her, looking embarrassed. "Don't you want to say something to Michael about his new pool plans?" Without turning back, Linda's voice carried over her shoulder, clipped and cold. "I'm sure you've already made up your mind, so what difference would it make what I think?" The door closed behind her with a definitive thud. Richard winced apologetically. "Don't mind her. The kids were really looking forward to swimming this summer, but they'll understand. Construction's exciting, maybe they can watch from our yard sometimes." Michael nodded, but a sense of unease had settled in his stomach. Linda's reaction, while not overtly hostile, carried an undercurrent of resentment that suggested this conversation was far from over. Still, he reminded himself it was his property and his decision to make. Surely as an adult, Linda would come to accept that reality. He had no idea how catastrophically wrong that assumption would prove to be. The Monday morning of pool removal arrived with perfect weather, clear skies, mild temperature, and a gentle breeze that rustled the newly leafed trees along Maple Ridge Drive. Michael had taken the day off work to supervise the dismantling process, wanting to ensure everything went smoothly. He risen early, moved his patio furniture to the garage, and cleared a path from the side gate to the pool for the workers. At precisely 8 o'clock a.m., a white truck emblazoned with Johnson's Pool and Spa Removal pulled into Michael's driveway. Two men in matching Navy uniforms introduced themselves as Craig and Tyler, efficiently explaining their process while unloading equipment from the truck. Michael offered coffee, which they gratefully accepted, and by 8:30, they were already draining the last bits of water from the pool using industrial pumps. The morning progressed smoothly. The team worked methodically, dismantling the aluminum sides of the pool after completely draining it. Michael alternated between working remotely from his patio and checking on their progress. By 11 o'clock, half the pool structure had already been disassembled and loaded onto the truck. Michael was reviewing some work emails on his laptop when a sharp voice cut through the ambient noise of tools and the radio the workers had playing softly. "What exactly do you think you're doing?" He looked up to see Linda Patterson standing at the edge of his lawn, arms crossed tightly over her chest. She wore white capri pants and a pink polo shirt, her blonde highlighted hair pulled back in a ponytail, oversized sunglasses perched on her head. Her stance was confrontational, one foot tapping rapidly against the ground. Michael closed his laptop and stood, maintaining what he hoped was a friendly expression. "Good morning, Linda. The removal company is taking down the old pool, like I mentioned on Sunday." Linda stalked across the lawn toward him, her eyes narrowing as she watched Craig and Tyler removing another section of the pool wall. "I didn't think you were serious. You can't possibly be doing this now." "I'm afraid I am," Michael replied calmly, gesturing toward the half-dismantled structure. "As I explained, the old pool is becoming a safety hazard. The new one will be much nicer." Linda's face flushed, two bright spots of color appearing high on her cheekbones. "You should have discussed this with the neighbors before making such a drastic decision. My children have been looking forward to swimming all summer. Ella's already invited friends over for pool parties. They'll be absolutely devastated." Michael maintained his composure, though he felt his patience being tested. "I did discuss it with you and Richard on Sunday. And while I've been happy to let your kids use the pool in the past, it is on my property. I'm sorry about their disappointment, but there's the community pool at Riverdale Park, and I believe the Jacksons on Elm Street have a pool they open to neighborhood kids." Linda's expression hardened, her voice rising. "That's completely unacceptable. The community pool is always overcrowded and filthy, and we don't know the Jacksons. My children are comfortable here. They've been using this pool for 3 summers now. They have pool rights." Michael blinked, taken aback by the unfamiliar term. "Pool rights?" "Yes, pool rights," Linda insisted, her voice growing louder. "The workers have paused their activities," glancing uncomfortably at the developing confrontation. "When you allow neighborhood children to use your pool consistently for years, you establish an expectation. You can't just suddenly revoke access. There are laws about this sort of thing." Michael took a deep breath. "Linda, I'm not aware of any laws regarding pool rights. This is my private property. I've allowed your children to use the pool as a courtesy, but I've never given up any property rights. I'm sorry, but the decision has been made. The construction company for the new pool is already scheduled." Linda stepped closer, lowering her voice to an intense whisper. "If you continue with this, I'll have no choice but to take legal action. I've documented every time my children have used this pool. We can prove established usage, and I have friends in the city council who would be very interested to hear about how you're disrupting the neighborhood harmony." The threat, delivered with such casual confidence, momentarily stunned Michael. He glanced at Craig and Tyler, who were now openly watching the exchange, tools temporarily idle in their hands. "I'm sorry you feel that way," Michael finally responded, struggling to maintain his composure. "But the removal is happening today, and construction for the new pool begins next week. Your children will be welcome to use the new pool when it's completed, under the same arrangements as before." Michael glanced apologetically at Craig and Tyler, who stood awkwardly beside the half-dismantled pool, clearly unsure whether to continue working or wait for the situation to resolve. The morning's efficient progress had ground to a complete halt. "Linda," Michael said, lowering his voice in an attempt to de-escalate, "I understand you're upset, but this is still my property and my decision. I'd appreciate it if we could discuss this civilly." Instead of calming the situation, his reasonable tone seemed to further infuriate Linda. Her nostrils flared as she took another step forward, invading his personal space. "Don't you dare condescend to me," she hissed. "I know exactly what you're doing. You've never liked children, have you? This is just an excuse to keep the neighborhood kids away from your precious property." The accusation was so absurd that Michael momentarily found himself speechless. He had coached youth soccer for 2 seasons, regularly contributed to the elementary school fundraisers, and had willingly shared his pool with neighborhood children for years. Before he could formulate a response, Linda turned abruptly toward the workers. "You too," she called out, her voice shifting to a saccharine tone that didn't match her rigid posture. "I'm sure you're just doing your job, but you should know there's a legal dispute regarding this pool. If you continue, you could be named in the lawsuit I'm planning to file." Craig and Tyler exchanged uncomfortable glances. The older of the two, Craig, cleared his throat. "Ma'am, we're just contracted to remove the structure. Any disputes between neighbors isn't really our—" "I'm not your ma'am," Linda cut him off sharply. "And I'm telling you that if you touch one more piece of this pool, you'll be hearing from my attorney." Michael had recovered from his surprise and stepped forward. "That's enough, Linda. You can't threaten my contractors. Please leave my property now." Instead of complying, Linda's behavior took an even more alarming turn. With deliberate steps, she walked directly to the edge of the partially dismantled pool and positioned herself between the workers and the structure, arms crossed defiantly across her chest. "I'm not going anywhere," she announced. "And neither is this pool." Michael ran a hand through his hair in frustration. "Linda, this is trespassing. Please be reasonable." "Reasonable?" she scoffed. "Was it reasonable for you to make a unilateral decision affecting the entire neighborhood? Did you stop to think about the children who depend on this pool for their summer activities? Did you consider the property values of all the homes on this street that benefit from having a recreational facility nearby?" The mental gymnastics required to characterize his private, above-ground pool as a recreational facility benefiting property values left Michael momentarily stunned. The workers looked increasingly uncomfortable, and Tyler discreetly stepped away to make a phone call, presumably to their supervisor. Michael decided to try one last approach. "Look, I understand change can be difficult, but the new pool will be even better. It will have proper steps, better filtration, and safer features. Your kids will be welcome to use it, just like before." Linda's expression didn't soften. "And what about the months in between? Ella and Mason have already been talking about swimming all winter. They've endured months of school, looking forward to their pool time." "Their pool time?" Michael repeated, his patience wearing dangerously thin. "Linda, this has never been their pool." "It might as well be," she snapped. "The positioning of the pool partially extends onto our land anyway." This claim was so patently false that Michael couldn't help but laugh in disbelief. That's simply not true. The pool is entirely within my property line by at least 15 feet. Prove it, Linda challenged, her chin jutting forward defiantly. Michael sighed heavily, then turned toward his house. Fine, wait here. He returned moments later with a rolled document, the property survey he commissioned before installing the original pool years ago, and had updated just last year when considering the in-ground replacement. He unrolled it on his patio table, securing the corners with small decorative stones. Here, he said, pointing to the clearly marked boundaries. As you can see, the pool is entirely on my property, not even close to the boundary line. Linda barely glanced at the document before dismissing it with a wave of her hand. That's obviously fake. Anyone could create that on a computer. Michael stared at her, genuinely perplexed by her refusal to acknowledge reality. The next 30 minutes crawled by an uncomfortable limbo. Craig and Tyler occupied themselves with organizing equipment and paperwork, stealing occasional glances at Linda, who remained positioned strategically by the pool, alternating between making additional phone calls and taking photos of the dismantled sections. Michael retreated to his patio, attempting to respond to work emails but finding it impossible to concentrate. Several neighbors had noticed the disruption by now. The elderly Johnsons watched discreetly from behind their living room curtains. Jessica Reeves, a kindergarten teacher who lived 3 doors down, slowed her car as she returned from morning errands, clearly trying to assess the situation. Michael offered a strained smile and a small wave that he hoped conveyed everything's under control, even when it clearly wasn't. At 11:42 a.m., a white and blue patrol car with Maple Ridge Police Department emblazoned on its side pulled up in front of Michael's house. 2 officers emerged, one older with salt and pepper hair and a weathered face that suggested decades of experience, the other considerably younger with a military-style haircut and the straight-back posture of someone relatively new to the force. Linda immediately abandoned her post by the pool and hurried toward them, her arms waving animatedly. Michael sighed and stood, straightening his shirt and approaching at a more measured pace. Officers, thank goodness you're here, Linda called out before they had fully exited their vehicle. I'm Linda Patterson. I called about the illegal destruction of neighborhood property. The older officer, whose nameplate identified him as Sergeant Reynolds, nodded politely. Good morning, ma'am. Can you explain what's happening here? Michael reached the group as Linda launched into her narrative, her voice pitched slightly higher than normal with an emotional tremor that hadn't been present during their earlier confrontation. This man, she said, gesturing toward Michael without looking at him, is removing a community pool that neighborhood children have used for years. My children have established recreational access rights, and he's destroying their summer without any consultation or notification. Sergeant Reynolds listened attentively, nodding occasionally while maintaining a carefully neutral expression. His younger partner, Officer Martinez, according to his nameplate, took notes on a small pad. He's already damaged part of it, Linda continued, pointing toward the partially dismantled structure. And the portion that extends onto my property line hasn't been touched yet, thankfully, but his workers were planning to remove it all. Michael waited for her to finish before speaking. Officers, I'm Michael Davidson. This is my property, and that's my private pool that I'm having professionally removed to install a new in-ground pool. I informed all neighbors, including Mrs. Patterson, about this plan earlier this week. Sergeant Reynolds nodded. I see. And what about this claim of the pool extending onto the adjacent property? It's completely false, Michael stated firmly. I have a property survey that clearly shows the pool is entirely within my boundaries. Would you like to see it? Yes, please, the sergeant replied. As Michael retrieved the survey documents from his patio table, he could hear Linda continuing to speak to Officer Martinez, her voice growing increasingly insistent as she elaborated on her children's disappointment and the community expectations that had been violated. When Michael returned with the property survey, Sergeant Reynolds examined it carefully, occasionally glancing up to compare the diagram with the actual yard layout. After a thorough review, he nodded. This appears to be in order, Mr. Davidson. The survey clearly shows the pool is located well within your property boundaries. He turned to Linda. Mrs. Patterson, based on this documentation, the pool is entirely on Mr. Davidson's property. Linda's face flushed. That document could be manipulated. Has it been verified by the county assessor's office? It bears the official seal and license number, Officer Martinez pointed out, indicating the stamped certification. That doesn't mean anything, Linda insisted, her voice rising. Anyone can buy a stamp online these days. I want you to order a new survey. Sergeant Reynolds maintained his professional demeanor despite Linda's escalating tone. Ma'am, we don't have the authority to order property surveys. This appears to be a legitimate document. He turned to Michael. Mr. Davidson, you said you informed the neighbors about the pool removal? Michael nodded. Yes, I spoke with everyone on Sunday afternoon, including Mrs. Patterson and her husband. The sergeant turned back to Linda. Is that correct, ma'am? Linda's lips thinned. He mentioned something about it, but he didn't properly explain the. Linda's reaction to the officer's statement was immediate and theatrical. Her eyes widened dramatically and her hand flew to her chest as if physically struck by his words. For 3 heartbeats, she stood perfectly still. Then the dam broke. "I cannot believe what I'm hearing," she gasped, her voice trembling. "Are you seriously taking his side without a proper investigation? Do you have any idea who I am in this community?" Sergeant Reynolds maintained his professional composure. "Ma'am, we're not taking sides. We're simply explaining the legal reality of the situation based on the documentation provided." This measured response only seemed to intensify Linda's distress. Tears welled in her eyes, spilling down her cheeks in perfect streams that somehow managed not to disturb her makeup. Her breathing became rapid and shallow. I can't," she stammered, fanning her face with one hand. "This is so upsetting. I have anxiety issues, and this confrontation is triggering a panic attack. My doctor has warned me about stressful situations." Officer Martinez stepped forward, concern crossing his younger features. "Would you like us to call medical assistance, ma'am?" "No." Linda snapped, the tears vanishing as quickly as they had appeared. Her posture straightened as her demeanor shifted dramatically from distressed victim to indignant authority. "What I want is for you to do your job properly. This is clearly a civil matter that requires proper legal review, not a dismissive 2-minute assessment." Sergeant Reynolds' expression remained neutral, though the slight tightening around his eyes suggested this wasn't his first encounter with this type of situation. "Mrs. Patterson, we've reviewed the facts presented and determined no laws are being broken. Mr. Davidson has the right to modify his property." Linda's face flushed a deep crimson. She squared her shoulders and lifted her chin. "I want both of your badge numbers and names spelled correctly, and I want your supervisor's name and direct number." When Sergeant Reynolds calmly provided the requested information without hesitation, Linda pulled out her phone and made a show of recording it, her fingers stabbing at the screen with unnecessary force. "I'll have you know that Captain Williamson is a personal friend," she announced, emphasizing each syllable. "We serve on the Riverdale Elementary PTA board together. She was at my Christmas party last year." If Linda expected this claim to intimidate the officers, she was sorely disappointed. Sergeant Reynolds merely nodded. "Captain Williamson is welcome to review our handling of this call, Mrs. Patterson. Now, unless there's anything else we can help with." Linda's eyes narrowed dangerously. "So that's it? You're just going to leave and let him destroy neighborhood property? What about my children's rights? What about the community impact? What about the noise ordinance violations that will occur during construction? What about the potential environmental impact of removing an established water feature? What about—" "Mrs. Patterson," Sergeant Reynolds interrupted firmly but politely, "all of those concerns would need to be addressed through proper channels. If you believe there are zoning issues or permit violations, you're welcome to contact the city planning department. If you believe you have a civil claim regarding property usage, you can consult an attorney. But there is no criminal activity occurring here that warrants police intervention." Linda's mouth opened and closed several times, resembling a goldfish suddenly removed from its bowl. When she finally found her voice, it had risen nearly an octave. "This is absolutely outrageous. I'm a taxpayer. I support our local police through the Neighborhood Watch program. I donate to the Police Benevolent Fund every Christmas. And this is how I'm treated? Like some common troublemaker." Officer Martinez shifted uncomfortably, but Sergeant Reynolds remained steady. "No one is characterizing you that way, Mrs. Patterson. We're simply explaining the limits of our authority in this situation." Linda's gaze darted between the officers, Michael, and the workers who were still waiting awkwardly by their truck. Something in her expression changed, a calculation, a realization that her current approach wasn't yielding the desired results. She drew herself up to her full height, smoothed her hair, and adopted an icy calm that was somehow more unnerving than her previous emotional display.